Hey folks, Job here. Wanted to make a short video on which hunter pets were best suited towards player versus player in patch 8.3, as well as which ones perform better in specific areas of PvP, whether that be stuff like arenas, world PvP, battlegrounds, so on. Generally speaking, I wouldn't expect these recommendations to change a whole lot going into Shadowlands as long as the pet specialization system doesn't deviate too much from what it's been previously. And so that is where you have the three separate specializations: ferocity, cunning, and tenacity, where ferocity covers most PvE DPS oriented pets, tenacity is going to cover the tanking pets or the more defensive oriented pets, and then cunning is going to be your utility pets or your PvP toolkits essentially. And those are the ones we're going to be focusing on primarily for this video, since I do find those most useful for the most general use cases in PvP. Alright, so to get started, we'll go ahead and just cover the pet specializations to begin with, kind of start with a broad scope and narrow it down from there. So first up, we've got ferocity, which as mentioned before is more of a PvE oriented loadout for a pet, so it's more DPS focused, not a whole lot in the way of survivability or utility. Of course, those are covered by the other two pet specializations that we'll discuss here in a second. But as far as the actual abilities themselves go, we've got Predator's Thirst, which gives you and your pet 10% leech, which is alright, all things considered. And then you've got Primal Rage, which, as mentioned before, is your Bloodlust or Heroism effect as a hunter, so 30% haste for all party and raid members for 40 seconds. Great ability, doesn't really surpass the utility of the cunning spells, but it is a fantastic ability nonetheless. Alright, so next up, let's go ahead and touch on tenacity very briefly. This is likely going to be the least used of the three pet specializations, for PvP especially, but just in general, to be quite honest with you. Not a whole lot of use cases for tenacity style pets, apart from perhaps soloing certain types of content. At any rate, here are the tenacity abilities for that particular specialization. We've got endurance training, which is a 5% health increase for both you and your pet, and the active ability for tenacity is survival of the fittest, which is essentially a 6-second shield wall for 20% damage over the duration. Neither of these are very impressive abilities in my opinion, and generally, if we've got Master's Call on the table or Primal Rage, there's really no reason to overlook those in favor of a tenacity pet. And last, but most certainly not least, we've got cunning, which is going to be the primary focus of this video, as well as the specialization that we're actually going to look at specific pet families for, because this is by far, in a way, the most useful pet specialization for PvP. Regardless of what type of PvP you're doing, this is where it's at. So for the cunning abilities, we've got pathfinding as the passive, which is an 8% increase to movement speed for both you and your pet. I think this is honestly a pretty good passive compared to the other two passives that are on offer for the other specializations. This one actually is semi-noticeable. And then of course the active ability is the famous Master's Call, which essentially is your freedom, right? So that's your blessing of freedom as a hunter, and it'll break any existing root or snare effect that's on you, as well as making you immune to those same effects for 4 seconds. In addition to all that, you're also able to use it on your teammates, so really just an incredible piece of kit all around. Alright, so now that we've got the basic specializations covered, we can go ahead and dive into the pet families themselves and the abilities that are unique to those pet families. So as mentioned before, I'm going to try to stay within the cunning specialization for the specific pet families, because I feel like these are really the ones that are most relevant to what we're talking about here, as far as being useful for your PvP loadout and enhancing your toolkit in that regard. So really we've got 3 different abilities that we're going to be looking at specifically that are on offer from a few different pet families. So we've got Mortal Strike, we've got Slows, and we've got Dispels. So those are the 3 primary abilities that I'm going to be looking at, and we'll be discussing those a little bit further. Alright, so the first ability I want to take a look at is actually the Slow effect. This is my personal preference when I'm just doing 1v1s, or when I'm out doing world PvP, solo PvP, anything like that. So really anywhere that a Mortal Strike is not required, I will be running a snare pet. This way it stops you from having to apply wing clip and trying to close distance on the target just to apply a snare as a survival hunter. May not be as much of an issue on a marksmanship hunter, and of course BM hunters would be an entirely different video as they have access to exotic pets. As far as which specific pet families offer a snare, we would be looking at either birds of prey, dogs, basilisks, or warp stalkers for that particular debuff. My preference is bird of prey. I think they have some pretty nice models, especially when you take a look at what's on offer from other pet families that provide the same snaring ability, namely basilisks and warp stalkers. Dogs as well. They've got some okay models, but for the most part they're not extremely impressive. Right, so next up we're going to be looking at the hunter version of the Mortal Strike debuff, which is typically something like Infected Wounds or Infected Bite, rather. So this particular debuff, of course, if you are running an arena composition that is lacking a Mortal Strike debuff, this is a situation where you'll definitely want to jump on these types of pets. It's also worth considering either a Mortal Strike pet or a Dispel pet, which we'll touch on in a little bit here, in the event that your arena composition doesn't require a reapplicable snare or a slow that the bird of prey or the dog would offer, for example. And as far as the pet families that offer the Mortal Strike debuff for hunters, you would be looking at either hyenas, raptors, or rodents. And while there aren't a ton of good options for rare appearances for these particular pets, they at least do have some nicer, unique color variations. Alright, so our final pet ability is going to be on offer from two different pet families, and that's going to be the Dispel from either the Sporebat or the Moth. So the Dispel is pretty good utility, all things considered, if you aren't in any particular need of a slow that's reapplicable automatically by your pet, and if your team composition already has the Mortal Strike debuff filled, it may be in your best interest to take a Dispel pet with you. Of course, these types of pets are going to be better suited towards particular matchups, but that can be said about any of the pets that are listed here. Once again, the rare offerings for the Sporebats and the Moths aren't exceptional, and their color variations are decent at best. They've got some newer updated models of the Sporebats that came along in Warlords of Draenor. Otherwise, you're going to be looking at some of the old Zanger Marsh models for those. Alright folks, we're going to conclude part 1 at this point, though in the next video we'll take a look at some of the rare and unique models for the pet families that we discussed previously, as well as where to track them down if you want to add some variety to your stable. If you've made it to this point in the video, thank you, first of all, and secondly, if you've enjoyed the guide, go ahead and subscribe for similar content on a weekly basis. There's a lot of exciting things happening in the World of Warcraft these days, so especially as we move closer to Shadowlands, and I plan on consistently covering the topics that I think might be interesting to watch now that I've got my editing situation more in order, as well as having a new microphone to mess around with. Anyways, that's about enough rambling for now. Thanks again for checking in, and we'll see y'all next time.
Bye.